Good afternoon to everybody and welcome to the second plenary session of our annual conference, which title is Mediterranean Capitalism Revisited. Before introducing the session, I really would like to thank the local organizers and the organizers all to give us the opportunity to have our annual conference in this online format. And I guess that it was especially demanding. I'm also very pleased and honored to chair a session whose keynotes and whose discussants are so well known and distinguished not to need to be introduced. However, let me briefly present them and present the contents and the organization of the session. Our keynotes are well-known and distinguished members of the CISES community, and they are editors of a forthcoming work entitled Mediterranean Capitalism Revisited, One Model, Different Trajectories for Cornell University Press, from which the title of the plenary of today. It is a work that, if I can well remember, past CISES conferences have helped to give birth to and to develop. I very briefly present them. I start from Luigi Burroni, Professor of Economic Sociology at the University of Florence, past editor of Stato e Mercato and coordinator of the very group of people who gave birth to CISEC, to the CISEC adventure. His expertise covers, among other things, variety of capitalism, local development, and local development policies. Then we have Emmanuele Pavolini with us, full professor of economic sociology at the University of Macerata. He's also affiliate professor at the Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna and now a national expert for the European Commission Expert Network on Social Policies. His expertise covers, among other things, comparative welfare state studies and social policy studies. Then we have Marino Regini, emeritus professor of economic sociology at the University of Milano, past president and honorary fellow of SEISI, and among other things, many other things, he has also been member of several ministerial commissions. We know he is a leading scholar in comparative political economy and industrial relations, and more recently, his interest moved also to higher education systems. To discuss their work, we have with us Anke Hassel, Professor of Public Policy at the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin. She is past Scientific Director of the Institute of Economic and Social Research of the Blocher Foundation. Her expertise covers several domains: comparative political economy, labor market institution, and industrial relation. I would remind that we met her very recently in a CISEC event, Author Me Critics, where she presented her last book, authored with Bruno Pallier, entitled Growth and Welfare in Advanced Capitalist Economies, published by Oxford University Press. I'm also very honored to have with us Cathie Martin, Professor of Political Science at the Boston University, President of the Comparative Politics section of the American Political Science Association, and past Chair of the Council of European Studies at Harvard University. Over her career, she has received many honors, many prizes. I only record the one for the book, The Political Construction of Business Interest, Coordination, Growth, and Inequality for Cambridge University Press. Her area of expertise cover, again, comparative politics and comparative political economy, and also education and training system. I very briefly go to the contents of our session. This plenary session takes the chance of the forthcoming book of our keynote speakers to discuss Mediterranean capitalism, its specificity, and eventually its major trends of change, especially over recent time, which have been characterized by the important, deep, and relevant subsequent crises. We all know, we all are aware that the capitalism and its institution have assumed in Southern European countries a peculiar form in comparison with coordinating liberal market economies of other European countries. We know this, and we also know, we all are aware of the fact that this specificity have translated in structural weaknesses for Southern European countries, making it quite hard for them all to cope with the crisis and adjustment. However, in spite of this awareness, in spite of this knowledge, which is the actual and extensive set of institutional specificity that characterize the Mediterranean variant of capitalism and eventually trends of change, was not an accomplished analytical exercise yet. Moreover, in spite a long season of reforms, why Mediterranean countries, why Southern European countries can't meet the challenge of competitiveness and growth is to be explained with deeper insight and major attention to the dimension of possible divergence or convergent processes and trajectories across Southern European countries, if we want to gain more grounded comparative understanding of Mediterranean capitalism. Of course, as emerged in the plenary of yesterday, this is not only a theoretical issue, an analytical issue that is important for all of us, but also an issue important in the perspective of recovery opportunities opening with the next generation EU resources. So I hope that this session will give us this chance to discuss these issues, or at least part of them. And I don't want to steal any further time to our speakers, but I have only to remind colleagues some organizational aspects of our plenary. We will have a first presentation by Marino Regini, about 20 minutes, followed by the discussion by Anke, Hassel, and Cathie Martin. Then co-editors will have a time for reply, overall 25 minutes, let's say. They will share and split the time according to the need of reply. I also would like to alert colleagues listening to, if they have questions to pose, they want me to pose to our speakers, to write them down in the question and answers chat. And to do it in advance, please start writing them down when Marino, Emmanuele, and Luigi will have time for their reply, so we won't lose any further time in the following. I think I stole time to our speakers, and I think we are ready to start, giving the floor to Marino Regini.
Thank you, Ivana. Thanks to the organizers who gave us the opportunity to present this book, which is going to be out in the next fall. And of course, a special thanks to my co-editors and to all the contributors to the volume. We have been working together for several years now, and I must say it has been very exciting intellectually, and it has also been a lot of fun, as we often say with Luigi and Emmanuele. Okay. I'm now trying to share some slides. Can you see them? All right. Of course, it's impossible to summarize a book of about almost 300 pages in 20 minutes. But it will come out soon, and so it will also be rather cheap, as you can see. So I hope you can buy it and read it all. And now what I can do is to just pick up a few points, and of course not going very deep into them, but pick up some of the main points of the book, and then hope that the discussants will try to go deeper into these points. The first point is the theoretical framework which we adopted to write this book, and the analytical toolkit we used. Second point is what is the main argument which runs through all chapters, namely that the Southern European economies chose a middle road to development that made them uncompetitive since a long time. Third, what are the different explanations for this lack of competitiveness? Four, what are the factors that supported this model of political economy for such a long time, because it's not a recent thing. I mean, this type of uncompetitive way of modeling growth is going on at least since the 1990s. And finally, very briefly, what lies ahead. Okay, first, of course, for I think that most participants to this plenary session who work in comparative political economy are very familiar with the varieties of capitalism theory, which has been the dominant theory in the last 20 years. Therefore, we took this theory as our departure point. However, noting immediately that Southern European countries are anomalous. They cannot easily fit the dichotomy that the VOC theory proposes, that is coordinated market economies or liberal market economies. And therefore, in part one of the book, which I'll show you in a minute, we combined the VOC approach with other streams of literature precisely to have a broader analytical toolkit to use. One is the literature on growth models that integrates the previous literature on the demand side of the economy. Second, the studies of the new role played by the state. Then a focus on the international dimension, because for countries like Southern European economies, countries, supranational regulation, since they belong to the Eurozone, is especially important. And finally, a variable which is often, let's say, forgotten or is often not dealt with in comparative political economy studies, that is socio-cultural factors. And you can see here the part one, after, of course, a rather long introduction to the book that Luigi, Emmanuele, and I wrote together through very long and interesting discussions. The part one of the book is precisely dealing with the four issues that I was mentioning before. A growth model by Lucio Baccaro, the role of the states by Giliberto Campana and Andrea Lippi, the role of the Eurozone divergence and the problem of the regulation of the Eurozone by Sofia Perez, and the changing sociocultural basis of Southern Europe by Emanuele Pavolini and Gemma Scalisi. Okay, so this is for the theoretical background and analytical toolkit that is summarized in the introduction and in the first part of the volume. Then I come to the second point. What is the main argument which runs through the whole book? The argument is that unlike traditional views, as a matter of fact, the subtitle of the book is One Model, Different Trajectories, because it is quite common to see that the trajectories of the four Southern European countries have been different. As I was saying, unlike a traditional views, the four Southern European economies show different institutional features. They have followed divergent policies and processes of change, and yet they do share a key common feature, and that's the one on which we specifically focus. The key common feature being an inability to find their own institutional competitive advantage, not only vis-à-vis the core European economies like Germany or France, but even vis-à-vis the other types of what we could call peripheral European economies. If we look at the Nordic countries, which are the northern periphery of the European Union, we see that they did follow a high road to development based on a very highly knowledge-intensive products, very high skills, high salaries, and so on and so forth. Eastern Europe, Eastern European, the other periphery, Eastern European countries, at least until 2010, then they changed in the last 10 years, but at least until then, they did follow a low road based to competitiveness, based instead on low salaries, low, very flexible, rather low prices, rather low skills, and low product quality. Southern European countries did not follow either a low or a high road, but they were, so to speak, stuck in a middle road of low competitiveness. And part 2 of the book shows that, in fact, all the key institutional arenas and policy fields that influence the type of economic path that a country follows. In all these institutional arenas and policy fields, Southern European countries reached suboptimal solutions. And here is a second part. So it may be rather weird to split the contents of the book in 2 parts, but I did because I wanted to show that in the first part we mainly deal with the major theoretical streams that we use as an analytical toolkit, and while in the second part we focus on specific policy areas: labor market and wage setting, institutions, welfare systems, financial system, and finally human capital formation, research and development, and innovation. And then, of course, in the conclusion, Luigi, Emmanuele, and I again try to make sense not just of the previous argument, but of the ways in which the various chapters, the 8 chapters by different contributors, made sense of the question. Okay. My third point is there are different explanations for the Southern European economy's lack of competitiveness. With some irony, I wrote here why pigs don't fly, but this is a citation which can only be understood by Italian people my age, who probably read a famous book, Porci con le ali, and the pigs that have wings. But here, pigs, of course, meaning Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, cannot fly. Why? There are 3 main explanations that are based on factors that are assumed to be common to all the Southern European economies and crucial to explain their lack of competitiveness. The first and by far most widespread explanation is based on the role of supply-side institutions, so the welfare regime, labor market regulation, industrial relations system, all the neoliberal and not just the neoliberal types of explanations of why the Mediterranean social model is so bad and should be changed. I remember, for instance, a famous article by André Sapir, who showed that the Mediterranean social model is the only European social model who has neither efficiency nor equity. But the point in this explanation is that it is the Mediterranean social model that hinders competitiveness. Now, it would be too long, of course, to go into that, but not only this explanation completely forgets about the demand side, I mean, completely overlooks the demand side, but it overlooks the fact that the Mediterranean social model went I mean, the four countries went into rather different directions in the last 20 years, especially Spain. Especially Spain, if I had the time here, I would show you some tables which we have in the book. Especially Spain, in the last 20 years, changed very strongly its welfare regime, going into a neoliberal, into a liberal direction, made its labor market very flexible, and also weakened very much its industrial relation system. And yet, the problem was not solved. So it is not it cannot be the something that unites the four countries, the so-called Mediterranean social model, the reason for low competitiveness, precisely for the reason that the four Mediterranean countries went into different directions. Second explanation is the peripheral position of Southern European economies in the Eurozone, which implies that they pay the cost of its bad design. Now, this is something that, for instance, Sofia Perez, in a different sense also Wolfgang Streeck maintained, which is, in our opinion, a much better explanation, but again has something for which we cannot accept it completely. And the reason why we cannot accept it completely is the fact that the lack of competitiveness started well before the starting of the Eurozone. A country like Italy, especially, which has had the lowest level of productivity growth and so on and so forth, started its competitiveness problems in the early 1990s, well before entering into the Eurozone. And maybe the entrance into the Eurozone made some aspects worse, but for this reason, it cannot be considered the factor which produced the lack of competitiveness. Finally, last but by no means least for us, the low degree of innovation, which stems from several reasons, like a low investment in research and development, a low investment in highly skilled human capital. This low degree of innovation hinders the ability to follow a high road of the Nordic type to competitiveness. And this is the type of explanation that we give most, that we think is the most important one. This low degree of innovation, the fact is that the promotion of a capitalism innovation-oriented relies on a strong state that invests in education and in training, in innovation policies, in the promotion of a competitive environment. And while the Southern European governments did nothing of this type in the last 20 years. On the other hand, in Mediterranean capitalism, what happened was flexibilization at the margin and very low level of investment in active labor market policies, a low level of investment in education and in innovation, a low institutional capacity of public administration, and a high support to labor-intensive activities. For all of these, of course, we have data tables in the book. I don't have time to show them here, but buy the book, read the book, and you'll find also the data which confirm this analysis. Briefly, I hope, which factors, now one could say, but if this model of political economy, this middle road to development was so, gave such a low competitiveness to these countries, how could it possible that it lasted so long? Well, we think that there were at least four factors that may supported this model for such a long time. First, low demand for, well, let me go through them because otherwise it takes more time. The first factor is a low demand for education and innovation policies by the type of economic structure that all the Southern European economies share. What are the features of the economic structure that are common to Southern Europe? Very briefly, and because you know all of them, at least for Italy, but they are largely common to the other Southern European countries. The predominance of small companies and of small companies which do not invest much in innovation, in research and development, and in highly trained human capital, and the predominance of low knowledge intensive sectors, the high diffusion of the shadow economy, and the high share of so to speak, self-employed workers, all of them put a premium on flexibilization of the labor market, on a series of other state policies, but not on state policies which invest in education, especially in higher education, in research and development, in innovation. So the economic structure has not traditionally demanded that. Then there is also, on the supply side, a second factor is the low institutional capacity of public administration. As you can see, if we compare this is the only table that I have decided to show. If we compare the four Southern European countries in red with four, not just three of the most advanced European countries like Germany, Sweden, and United Kingdom, but even Poland, we see that the institutional capacity for economic policies, for research and innovation, and for education is systematically lower. And what is the consequences of this low institutional capacity? The consequence is that many development policies are quiet politics, to use to borrow a good categorization by Culpeper. It means that they are not part of the electoral agenda and are often planned by small policy networks with the strong technical component. But the low institutional capacity of public administration creates serious constraints in the supply of such policies, because in order for policy networks to work fine, there must be a policy administration which is efficient. And second, the low capacity to produce effective collective goods triggered the consensus towards the decrease of public expenditure and also the reduction of taxes. We have seen it in the program of the Italian Lega, reducing, therefore, the possibility to invest in education and in innovation policies. The third factor, and then I quickly go to the end, is the fact that although we can blame this type, we do blame this type of policy of middle road, of low added value and a high labor intensive model, but although we blame it, it became particularly appealing to policymakers for at least three reasons. First, in terms of electoral consensus, because the expansion, especially in Spain, the expansion of construction of the building industry favored an increase in real estate yields, meeting the interests of the average voter. So a lot of electoral consensus for that. Second, it created significant tax revenues for local governments. And third, it contributed to high employment growth in countries which are characterized by a low level of labor market participation. Final, I hope I have not exceeded my 20 minutes. In any case, this is the last, of course, since the title is What Lies Ahead, it cannot be but the last slide. Ahead of us will lie a quoting the Beatles, a long and winding road to competitiveness, or will the pandemic crisis work as a game changer? Here I quote a sentence of our concluding chapter, where Luigi, Emmanuele, and I wrote, the only solution to the low level of private investment in research and development and skill formation that hampers innovation would be an extraordinary effort by the Southern European states to compensate for the poor performance of their business sectors with a substantial and well-directed increase in public expenditure in this field. However, we wrote this book just at the beginning of the pandemic crisis, and so we still had in mind especially the effects of the Great Recession of the 2008 crisis, and we wrote, therefore, the 2008 crisis could have been the right time for a strategic rethinking of development policies, but this opportunity has been missed. So negative, pessimistic conclusion in the concluding chapter. However, when we finished the writing the book, unfortunately, the COVID pandemic struck, and fortunately, the Next Generation EU plan was developed, and we have a final part of our conclusion in which we do acknowledge that they may represent a dramatic and fundamental turning point, what political scientists call a critical juncture, giving rise to radical change. Because sure, in the short run, Southern European countries are the most severely hit by the consequences of the crisis. But in the long run, a robust neo-Keynesian approach, such as the one which is inspiring the Next Generation EU plan and the PNRR in Italy, can contain the negative socioeconomic consequences of the pandemic, but also, even more importantly, it can bolster a modernization agenda in many policy fields. So to finish, the pandemic could turn out to be a window of opportunity to end with a note of optimism, to substantially improve Mediterranean capitalism, and to bring our countries closer to the core European political economies. Of course, the ways in which the various institutional arenas which we have studied in this book, the ways in which they will react to the new challenges, as well as the role that the national actors will play, will be crucial in this respect. Thank you.
Thank you, Marino, for this exhaustive overview of such a complex dimension, and for summing up in such an effective way such a complex work. I go very quickly through the first discussion of your work and ask Anke Hassel to take the floor, please.
Yes. Thank you very much. I hope you can see my screen. I'm not sure whether you can. Can you just briefly tell me whether you can see my screen, my slides?
Yes, we do.
Yes, okay. So thank you very much to the organizers for this fantastic panel, and congratulations to Luigi, Emmanuele, and Marino for this very interesting and very timely book. I read this book with great interest, and as we have heard before, I just published a book together with Bruno Parlier, and many of the things we are discussing there are sort of complementary to what you're doing in your book. So I think it is a really good combination. So the contribution of the book is really timely, and Marino has already hinted to that, because we are now facing the second big crisis in the last 20 years. We had the Eurozone and financial crisis in the year 2009. We now have the COVID crisis. And in both crises, we think that the Eurozone and the European Union integration is coming to a crunch. And we do not really know whether the project can continue after the crisis. And we now face another major period of adjustment. And in both crises, the Southern European countries play a particular role. And to understand the Southern European economies, the political economies, and the role they play within the European integration project is really important. And the book fills a big gap and addresses these issues, which is very useful and very important for the further perspective. The second contribution the book makes, and Marino has already hinted to that, is really to say the economics interpretation and explanation and the economic perspective on Southern Europe is deficient. So what he addresses with the supply side explanation, that has been part of the policy discourse for a very long time. It was part of the policy discourse also after the financial crisis. And that is to say, if you just regulate labor markets, if you cut down on social spending, if you decentralize decision making, then you can foster a regime and foster economic development, which allows a model for competitiveness, which allows then the Southern European countries to catch up. And we have seen after this, the financial crisis that some changes have been made, but it did not lead to a catching up process, and it did not lead to a new economic regime which could catch up with the rest of Europe. So I think that the authors are absolutely correct to say that anything in terms of explanations which has to do with a neoliberal policy design or with the perspective of economists on Southern Europe will not help us. But we need alternative explanations, and that is what the book is trying to do, is to give an alternative explanation to what is happening. And again, this is very useful. And the third aspect, which I like very much about the book, is to, when it looks at different policy fields and policy areas, like education policy, innovation policy, social spending, the welfare state, etc., we need to look at policy, but we also need to look at capacity, administrative capacity, as an important aspect for the understanding for economic development in the EU member states. So I think these are three major contributions that the book makes in a discussion which already has a lot of contributions to different models of capitalism. And at a time when most of us thought the varieties of capitalism debate is sort of going to an end, or does not, there's no further future for the varieties of capitalism debate, this book actually shows otherwise. And it shows that it makes sense to look at these countries and at these models and these different political economies and try to understand them. And I like that very much. So what I will do, so Cathie and I are sharing the discussion of the book, and what I will do is I will say a little bit about chapter 1 and chapter 2, and then I will jump to the end of the book and I will make some comments on chapter 8, and then Cathie will follow after me and she will fill in the rest. She will fill in on the other chapters. So we will probably not make it to sort of give a completely comprehensive perspective on all the chapters, but we will say something on at least most of the chapters. And I will start with the first chapter, which is on Southern European growth models, which is by Lucio Baccaro. And I will start with a graph which shows the per capita household income in different countries. And the countries you see there in the light blue is Germany, then green is Spain, light green is Spain. France is, I think it is black. And then Italy is darker green, and Sweden is purple, and the UK. So these are the countries. And what you can see is that the two green countries are Spain and Italy. And you see that they are falling behind over time. And they're particularly falling behind in the increase of per capita household income after the financial crisis in 2009. And there is a strong distinction between these countries and the development of these two countries compared to the other big European member states. And this is a phenomenon we need to explain. And this is, so to speak, the starting point of the book. We can also look at a similar phenomenon when we look at the variation coefficient of GDP per capita. And the variation coefficient of GDP per capita means that if it increases, the distance between the countries becomes smaller, and if it decreases, the difference between countries become bigger. And what we see is that on the whole, if we no, it's the other way around. If it decreases, the difference between countries becomes smaller. So if we look at the EU as a whole, at all the 28 countries, we see that the differences between EU member states on the whole become smaller. But if we only look at the old European member states, and these are the Western European member states without Eastern Europe, we see that among these countries, the difference is actually becoming bigger. And the interpretation of that data is that, in fact, we do see a catching up process, but the entire catching up process is done by Eastern Europe. So Eastern European countries do, in fact, catch up in terms of GDP per capita. But if we only look at the old member states, there is a divergence process. And that divergence process is similar to what we have just seen, that the Southern European countries are really lagging behind the rest of Europe. And Regini, Marino explained that in terms of the high road and the low road, so that the high road are the Northern European countries, which have high competitiveness, which have high growth rates. And this is based on a high level of skills, a high level of investment in research and development, and strong competitiveness of these economies. And in the low road, he looks at Eastern Europe and say these countries can actually catch up because they are cheap and because they occupy a specific niche and role in the supply chain in global markets. And what we do not see is where Southern Europe actually fits in, because they are too expensive to play the low road, but they are not productive enough to become part of the high road, and they are stuck in the middle road. And that is the main argument of the book. So in our book, we have had a similar analysis, and we come to a very similar conclusion. And we actually follow the work from Lucio Baccaro on growth models, that we say, there are different types of growth models, and we call them growth regimes. And we say some of them are demand-led, and some of them are export-led. And you can really show that the specialization on either an export-led growth model or a demand-led growth model really leads to very different results, because the underlying economy is very different. So if we look at export-driven growth, we have a process of industrialized specialization, in particular in the manufacturing industries. And we have Germany as the case, which is investing and specializing heavily in manufacturing exports. But we also have Sweden as another case of export-led growth in the Fordist period, where the government invested a lot in the public sector, but also supported export manufacturing sectors. And in contrast to that, we have countries which were traditionally much more demand-led, and they were wage-led. And among the demand-led economies, we used to have the United Kingdom and the United States. They were both demand-led growth models, and they're still demand-led growth models, which then did not pursue a specialization in manufacturing, but they pursued a specialization in finance and in financialization. And a lot of the US and the UK economies are driven by consumer demand and by consumer spending, and they are not specialized in exports. And we have a different kind of demand-led growth, and these are the Southern European countries, Italy and Spain, Portugal, and Greece, which are also demand-led. So these economies also are based on consumption and consumer consumption, but the process of how consumption and demand is created is not based on financialization, as in the UK and the US, but they're really based on public spending, and in particular welfare spending. And as we can see, that over time, when we look at these different growth regimes, we look at either the export-led growth regimes, which are the Germanic countries, but the Northern European countries. We can also see that export growth models are adopted by Eastern European countries, the low road countries, as Marino has said, that they are export focused but not as strong and are not as productive as the other export-led growth model. But then we have these two demand-led growth regimes, and one is the private demand-led growth regimes, financialization, as I said before, and then we have the public demand-led growth regime, and this is really Southern Europe, and we include France, by the way, in this analysis, and we say that the economy is really based by strong public spending and weak exports. And the problem is that this is not sustainable within EMU, because within EMU we have a set of rules that do not allow public demand-led growth. And that was very apparent when it comes to the financial crisis. And we have seen the development after the financial crisis. And when you start then cutting public demand, this has a dampening effect on growth rates. And this is the explanation why growth has been lagging behind further and further after the financial crisis in 2009. And this is our analysis of the Southern European countries, why these growth regimes are different from other growth regimes, and why in itself a public demand-led growth regime is perfectly sustainable, but it is not sustainable within the EMU. And we can see how the adjustment after the financial crisis has started changing these growth regimes, but in a particular way. So this is our analysis of the economic model. Chapter 2 deals with administrative and policy capacities, which I found very interesting. So, and the argument in chapter 2 is to say we see different trajectories. And we see in all four countries, we have actually very different stories. So in Portugal, we have a deliberate but also effective trajectory that has allowed the country to improve its state policy capacity. So Portugal, in the entire book, Portugal is actually the shining example of positive development. Portugal has a better growth rate, has a better policy approach, and has made some positive steps towards development. The second example is Spain, and Spain is sort of the second best in class. Spain has reached some improvement, but there is a lot of institutional resilience, and there's a lot of conflict in intergovernmental relations, and that also has to do a lot with federalism and the centralization of Spanish politics. So Italy is the third in line, and Italy has seen a lot of reforms, and it has seen a lot of change. But despite all these reforms, and as the authors say, maybe also because all these reforms, we see a schizophrenic oscillation. So these are the words of the authors: a schizophrenic oscillation of the reforms, which lead to a incapacity of improving its weak policy capacity. And Greece has not been capable of doing any kind of serious reforms. It has very weak state policy capacity because it lacks any real attempts to improve administration performance. So this is the assessment in the book about the different trajectory on administrative capacities and policy reforms. So what are these implications? What is the implication of this analysis? I think the chapter on administrative capacities really brings us back to a contribution which we already had on the Mediterranean countries, which was done by Rhodes and Molina, who looks at the role of the state. And the role of the state is that their analysis is to say, and that is the same with this book, to say Southern Europe is really a bunch of coordinated market economies, but it is in a way where coordination is not done by private actors. And private actors in the language of VOC means the trade unions and employers association, who as private actors do a lot of the coordination within a CME. in the Southern European countries, these associations exist as well. The unions exist and the employers exist as well, but they do not see it as their role to perform coordination among each other or with each other, but they see it as their role really to capture the state and capture the government in order to win private gains. And what the state must do then, because you have these associations who do not fulfill the role of coordination, the state has to compensate for a lack of coordination, which doesn't happen otherwise. So the interest associations that usually regulate the markets and CMEs, they address the state, and they do not address the market. And you do not have strong private actors, and private actors are seen in a way as being independent of state protection. So autonomous actors who do not rely on governments and government protection are not really performing their role in these Southern European economies. And the question really is, and the chapter explains a little bit of that, but the question really remains is, so why did the Iberian countries, Portugal and Spain, managed to partially overcome the state capture by interest associations? Why did they perform better? How did Portugal manage to come out of this stagnating economic situation? And how did they improve some of the capacity of government policies? The second question, which I would also address to the chapter, is really to ask, so why is the Italian business community not pushing for more reforms and becoming more autonomous? Because we all know that Italy has a strong export sector. So why do the companies who are part of the export sector in Italy not push for reforms that makes them more autonomous, that they can play a normal role of a CME? And finally, if we look at Greece, the question is really, what is the most promising approach to pursue public sector reforms in Greece? How can we find any initiative or any inroad into the Greek political system and the public administration system, which would allow them for pursuing any kind of reform? So chapter 8, very briefly on innovation policy. What we see in innovation policy is that that we have a weakness in the supply and in the demand for research-based innovation by companies. So Marino has already hinted to the fact that the average size of companies in Southern Europe is relatively small. So small companies do not invest as heavily in R&D compared to big companies. So you need a certain size of companies to get really serious research in innovation. So if you do not have the investment by private companies, you do not really get the complementary investment by the state that could help for companies to develop. And that on the whole leads a move and a trajectory towards more low productivity sectors. And Marino has also mentioned that, and that is also shown in the book, that there is a lot of evidence for low productivity sectors, and that is partly the tourism sector, but also the construction sector. So if you have then a lack or a unsuitability for the demands and as well as the supply for high quality human capital, then you get the problem. So what kind of training and higher education system should actually invest in? If you think about it in terms of higher education policies, you need to have a public administration system who anticipates certain demands and needs in the business community in order to train people in higher education fields on the assumption that there is a demand for these people who then get jobs in these sectors. But this is often not borne out by reality. In reality, if governments start investing in higher education, what you can see is that these highly skilled people tend to emigrate because the local labor market actually does not supply the jobs for these highly skilled people. So you do not really have the demand for highly skilled people. So, and then if you do not have a collaboration between the corporate sector in investment in innovation. And then if you do little to promote innovation, and if you then this little, what is done to promote innovation, if you do that badly, then you do not get much of development. And again, you get some diversification also in the field of innovation. And you get the similar contrast that we had before, that Spain and Portugal are doing better in contrast to Greece and Italy. And what overall, you have a lack of coordination mechanism between the supply and the demand for innovation and skills. And what I would like to point out is it is not an easy question of how you can promote innovation. So innovation is based on a public-private interplay. You do need public money for high-quality research, but you also need private demand for highly skilled workers and the use of public research quality. If you do not have the private demand, you might get public investment into higher education and into research, but you really don't get any development in these areas because companies do not pick up these workers which you train. You need private capitalization on innovation. You need openness of markets. You need the protection of patents. You actually have to allow companies to use innovation practices in order to promote their businesses. And you also need the public know-how of how to run high-quality research and education institutions. And if you look at that, you can think about it as a circle where you have the public universities and research policy on the one hand. They produce high-skilled workers. They produce an innovation. Then you have private business marketization of these product innovation, and then in turn they generate this support for research and development, which then the government can pick up. But the point here is really, if you have one of these components missing, it is not good enough just to invest in public university and research if you do not have the business side that can actually pick up the high-skilled workers and the product innovation you get in research. So how should we think about good innovation policy? One aspect is to involve business in innovation policy and research. So to set up networks of business and the corporate community that works on innovation policy. You have to think about how to enable market entry for companies. You have to think about how to foster collaboration, and you have to focus on research spending, and you have to make sure that you spend this money wisely. So I'll conclude and I sort of just quickly summarize before I hand over to Cathie that what we see in the book is that there's actually a lot of diversity in Southern Europe, that it's actually sometimes very difficult to generalize across these four cases because you have different trajectories. You have more, and the second big message of the book is that there's more stagnation than change. There's more stability, but not stability in a good way, but more in terms of stagnation than change. And finally, if you look at the diversity between these two different countries, it is actually quite difficult to talk about different types and to put Southern Europe into the type of Mediterranean capitalism, and that we probably need more fine-grained analysis when we look at these different countries. But anyway, I would strongly encourage you to buy the book because it's really interesting. It fills a particular gap in the literature, and it will move on this research field further. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anke, for reminding us the importance of growth model, the importance of administrative capacity, and still the growing heterogeneity of Southern European countries that we have to keep in mind. I very quickly go to Cathie, asking her to share her discussion. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to join this this conference. I'm very excited to be here, and particularly for giving me the opportunity to comment on this fascinating new volume. I think Luigi, Emmanuele, and Marino, you've done a wonderful job really bringing together a lot of very rich material. It's incredibly thoughtful. It's almost like an encyclopedia. of trying to understand what's been going on in this region today. And I think it'll fill a huge gap in the literature. I'm only sorry that we can't do this in person, but I'm delighted to hear that the vaccination process is moving right along in Italy. And we all hope that normalcy will return soon. Now, Marino has already presented the major arguments of this excellent volume. Okay, so let's see. I see. Yeah, there we go. And what I'm going to do is just reiterate a couple of the major themes, give some thoughts about some of the specific chapters, and then raise some broad questions about the book. And so sorry, the authors argue convincingly that the book fills a gap in our understanding of the Mediterranean model of capitalism, and that this is important for a few reasons. For one thing, Italy and Spain have huge economies, and yet the region has been understudied. The countries also have tried really hard to catch up with their more prosperous northern neighbors, but they've had great difficulty doing so, especially after the global financial crisis and the sovereign debt crisis. So the authors wish to understand the components of the model, the reasons for the development of the model, the country's problematic trajectories after the financial crisis, and whether one model accurately reflects the full range of experience. So they hit on some of the key components and characteristics of the model. Family plays a crucial regulatory role in organizing the welfare state. Institutional complementarities are limited. The countries have had special problems after the financial crisis, lower labor productivity, an unstable growth regime, a low growth equilibrium, chronically underfunded research and development and human capital investment, limited state capacities, and also some pernicious trends in terms of political stability. Italy and Greece in particular have had anti-state populist sentiments that are quite disturbing. So the book's value added, I think, is really important here, that the authors recognize at the outset that the varieties of capitalism framework does not fully explain this case, and they want to move to new avenues of inquiry. In particular, the connections between supply side institutions and demand side macroeconomic policies. And Anke has already mentioned her work with Bruno on growth regimes. And I think that's a really exciting project. I have been delighted to have a chapter in that volume as well. The impacts of the international context on domestic policy choices and growth strategies, the changing role of the state, and the role of culture in convergence and divergence of the models in countries. Some of the dysfunctions of the models reflect poorly performing social and industrial relations regimes, the country's peripheral location in the Eurozone, and also chronically underfunded research and development and human capital investment. And I think that one of the best parts of this book is it's extremely well organized. As Anke pointed out before, each one of the first 4 chapters deals with one of the pillars of these new perspectives that are being brought in. And the second part of the book, the policy part of the book, in each policy area, you see these arguments revisited. So the book is very well organized and there's a nice flow. And I commend the authors for doing that. Okay, so I had, sorry, I have morning voice here. It's really early my time. I wanted to start out with some thoughts about the chapters that I'm going to cover, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And the first chapter is by Sophia Perez. And Sophia considers which level of analysis, internal domestic versus external international, is most important in influencing the Southern European countries' responses to crisis. She looks in particular at the Eurozone crisis and the sovereign debt crisis. And we've seen some other people who've taken up this issue, such as Beccaro and Klaus Arminjon and Eric Jones. So Perez says that external content, the external context swamps international institutional factors, that the Eurozone governance model worsened the problem of foreign investors' sudden stop. Foreign investors suddenly decided that they were going to withdraw currency from these countries, and the Eurozone governance model, in a way, worsened this tendency. For one thing, there was a very long delay before the European Central Bank intervened in the sovereign debt crisis. The ECB made financial assistance contingent on fiscal austerity, and these factors fed the bond market panic. So it was a very problematic trajectory in these countries' efforts to try to get on top of the problem. Now, I had several questions about this process. So by the way, Sophia, then just to reinforce it, she concludes that the external context swamps internal institutional distinctions, and that although countries diverged in their growth regimes and also in their labor market institutions, at the end of the day, these simply didn't matter very much. So I found this argument to be extremely persuasive. I think that Sophia shows with razor-sharp logic the problems with domestic explanations. But I had a couple of questions. And one question is that we know that domestic institutions matter some of the time. So I was trying to figure out the extent to which the circumstances under which international arrangements triumph over domestic ones. Does the international context primarily matter at moments of intense disarray and system collapse? And these were moments that we saw with the global financial crisis and the sovereign debt crisis. These were a significant turning point in the political economy. Or do these matter? Does the institutional international context matter over the long haul? How much of the disparity of the international context? How much of it was anticipated from the very beginning of the Eurozone discussions? Does this disparity reflect a specific balance of power among the countries, the North and the South? And I think this is a really important question. What are the social relations of production here? How much of this North-South relationship is played out on an ongoing basis? Or does this North-South relationship simply become important at critical junctures? Is there, in fact, a kind of core periphery dynamic that allows the North to win at the expense of the South? And has this been going on for a very long time? So the authors make institutional arguments about this disparity. They look at the rules and regulations governing the European monetary system. But I'm also interested in some of the more fundamental dynamics, the power dynamics among countries. Now, the fourth chapter, again, I found absolutely fascinated. I love these individual chapters. And then the fourth chapter by Emmanuele Pavolini and Gemma Scalisi, they look at the socio-cultural variables and how these socio-cultural variables matter to divergent capitalist paths and varieties of capitalism. They wish to know whether these countries have diverged and whether it makes sense to talk about a singular Mediterranean model. And they have a wonderful creative use of survey data on public opinion. They use cluster analyses in two ways. One, they try to see how the dimensions hang together. And second, they try to figure out whether within country differences add up to a single model or multiple models. And one of their particular interests in terms of how the dimensions cluster is they have some theories about gender and female work and some of the kind of soft social policy sides that they think have bearing on development strategies, such as reliance on technological change. Now, what they find is, first of all, that these dimensions do cluster, that things such as the evolution of women in the workforce make for higher levels of education spending and higher levels of technology investment. So it's the changes in the workforce double back to some of the aspects of the economic growth regime. And the second thing they find is that they're basically two distinctive Southern European models. That Spain and Portugal cluster with continental European countries, and Italy and Greece cluster with Central and Eastern European countries. So I had several questions about this chapter. And the first question is, what is the basic dynamic at play here? I was interested in how they think cultural values are brought to bear on capitalist paths and industrial relations systems. So, what's the relationship between institutions and cultural values? How do cultural values play back into institutions? And there are two possibilities, I believe. One is that social networks and institutions create certain kinds of cultural explanations, and these networks and institutions influence preferences both of the public as well as of elites. And the second possibility is that cultural narratives themselves shape institutional evolution. So work I've been doing on literature and industrial relations systems takes this second track, that institutional evolution actually reflects deeper cultural values that go way back. I'm also wondering where change comes from in this model. And why is it that the Southern European countries take different paths? Again, there are two possibilities here, I think. And one is that there are really deep-seated differences between the Iberian Peninsula countries versus Greece and Italy. And another is that there have been more recent changes. And this chapter really focuses on the recent changes in public opinion data. And of course, public opinion data doesn't go very far back. So the authors are bound to look at only the past few decades. But it's also maybe possible that there are deeper changes. So public opinion has evolved in the recent decades on gender differences, etc. Has this evolution driven apart the two types of Mediterranean countries, or have these differences always been there? Now, I also wondered, I think there's a little bit of an inconsistency in this idea of two models, and the fact that both sets of countries have modernization paths that have led to low productivity and labor-intensive jobs, as the authors suggest on page 110 in the book. And so I think the way to reconcile this is that both the two model argument and Sophia's internationalization and the international context argument make a difference. That Sophia's argument says that international context swamps the differences, and so it may be that more recent changes reflect these changes that Sophia says is imposed by the international context. Now, chapter 5 by Alexandra Alfonso, Doragatti, Molina, and Tazzanari again asks why countries are fairly different before 2008 and why they converge after the global financial crisis, why they have not recovered from the crisis in industrial relations, and how much does this reflect poor national strategies versus something else. And they briefly mentioned the traditional model of Southern European labor market policy, extensive state intervention in production, high employment protection and unemployment protections for core workers, a big reliance on families as social providers, weaknesses of trade union and employer organizations. And they have some fascinating suggestions about why this model develops: late development, small scale firms, authoritarianism, heterogeneity, heterogeneity of producer systems, and church state tensions. And they suggest that although these things matter, there's also been some variation, at least before 2008, that reflect legacies from domestic institutions of these four countries. But then there's been convergence after the crisis due to neoliberal economic globalization and European integration. So, my question for these authors has to do with why the northern countries that are late industrializers, small state firms, and latent democratization, these are northern European countries, the Nordic countries in particular, they pursue an export route. And you get Katzenstein's argument about small states. Denmark is a great example of this. When the southern European countries that are also late industrializers have small-sized firms and are late democratizers, pursue a protectionist route. So, what is it about the northern periphery versus the southern periphery that's different? And I think this chapter does a great job at demolishing neoliberal arguments. So I want to know when they think neoliberalism is going to end. Chapter 6 covers some of the same ground. I notice I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go right to my final three questions. So my final three questions are these. The first one is, what precisely is the Mediterranean model, and what does it say about political economy? I think the authors have made a Herculean effort to give us a precise definition of the Mediterranean model, but I'm still not sure I completely understand it. So I think that we should talk collectively about, is there one model or two? Do the Spain and Portugal versus Italy, Greece splits persist across all areas? Does it still make sense to talk about a Mediterranean model if these cleavages are super important? A second question is, what is the internal logic of this model? So chapter 4, for example, offers these really useful clusters of public opinion on the issues, but they conclude that the Mediterranean model is best folded into two other models. Is there a distinctive Mediterranean logic to how growth and the economic sector fits with the social sector? And is there a distinctive Mediterranean growth regime that brings together the demand side and supply side? And Lucio Boccaro offers us this great discussion of this question in chapter 1, as Anke has already gone over. But Lucio readily admits that Italy has not fit this mode. The second question, I think, is this question about domestic versus external origin of the model. And I've already kind of touched on this. I think that there are tensions between the interests of the region and the interests of potentially predatory actors outside of the region. And I'm really curious to hear how far back in time these go. Is there a kind of core periphery dynamic at play that has deep historical roots? And can a true understanding of this region occur without the recognition of fundamental power imbalances? Are these dynamics Southern Europe loses so that the North can win, deeply interwoven into the fabric of the region. Now, my third question has to do with the essential narrative and cultural components of this model. So in my own work, I've been using literature from the 18th and 19th centuries to understand the emergence of varieties of capitalism, poverty regimes, industrial relation regimes, and education systems. And what I can show with this analysis of literature is that Nordic countries have very different symbols and narratives from the liberal and continental countries. They have different views of the individual and society, social class, cooperation versus conflict, and the role of the state. They're also in a peripheral region, but they have conceptions of a very strong organic society that motivates social investment, strong state. They have weak familial ties. They have a value on education and skills connected to the strong society. And they have strong expectations of cooperation. And that all these institutions that we've seen for the past several hundred years, worker cooperatives, macro corporatism, strong vocational training systems for workers, active labor market policies today are all consistent with these values. And I can show with my literature going back to the early 18th century differences. So this is in poverty snippets in an article with Chevalier coming out in British Journal of Political Science. This is Britain, this is Denmark, and this is France. And you see that France has almost no references to skills in conversations about poverty, writings about poverty in fiction. And Denmark has a huge attention to skills. And here's our views of charity in poverty snippets. Denmark makes almost no references to charity when they talk about poverty or poor people, unlike Britain and France. Now, to get back to the cultural narrative of the Mediterranean region then, the authors suggest some common policy themes such as family, continental model, but kind of less so, legacies of authoritarian states. But do the countries in this region share a historical cultural identity? And if so, what are the essential characteristics of it? Are there shared narratives about processes of collective political engagement in these countries? What does the cultural narrative look like? Is it a distinctive profile from other countries? So if one were to tell a story about workers and poverty and education, what would the narratives be, and how might these narratives resonate with contemporary political economic choices? So thanks very much.
Thank you, Cathie. Thank you for this discussion over some different aspects, also cultural ones, that is a novelty in a sense in this approach of political economy. I ask Emmanuele, Luigi, and Marino. Well, I suppose it will be impossible to reply to so many suggestions. So to, in a sense, pick some of them and give your reply. We follow the order you think it's better to give our discussant satisfaction in terms of reply, let's say.
We decided earlier than that since I had a long time in the presentation, Luigi and Emmanuele will at least start, then I will maybe make some final comments. And I don't know whether they wanted to share, for instance, Luigi could answer Anke and Emmanuele could answer Cathie's questions, or however you want, and then I will make some very final points.
I can start trying to address some of the questions and then give the floor to Emmanuele. But first of all, I would like
10 minutes, Luigi, please.
Okay, sure,
Okay.
sure.
Not more.
No, don't worry. I mean, These are very important questions, so we would need more time, but I know that there are some structural constraints, so we'll be very, very brief. But first of all, I want to thank you, Cathie and Anke, for all your comments, and I'm very sad that I could not reply to every of them because they are very, they need a lot of time. And it's, on the one hand, it's a pity that we have already closed the book, so it is not easy for us to include them. It is impossible for us to include them in the book, but as you know, a volume is always the first step of a long path of research, so we will take into account for the coming activities of research we will do in the coming months and years. Yes, I'd like to focus on 2 or 3 of the problems that have been emphasized both by Anke and Cathie, and one of them is this idea of, are we facing with one single model that can be defined the Mediterranean model, or there are some important internal differences? And another issue that has not been raised, but that is strongly connected with this, is, are these differences new, or they were already present, for example, at the beginning of the 90s when we started? I mean, we started to look at that critical juncture, that is the beginning of the 90s, for each of the chapters. And I think that the book shows that there are both things. On one hand, there were already some differences at the beginning of this period, and especially, for example, if you look at the role of sectorial specialization that are particularly relevant, given the fact that both of you talked about the productivity problem. Because in Italy, for example, manufacturing was playing a much more important role during the 90s, and is still playing a much more important role now in comparison with all the other 3 countries. Whilst, for example, construction and building industries is much more strong in Spain. So there were some differences at the beginning, and there were also some differences in some of the variables that you mentioned. For example, Anke mentioned institutional capacity, and we see that already in the 90s there was slightly some differences in terms of institutional efficiency and capacity of public administration. So it was already there, the difference. But the crisis of 2008, and this is important, I think, an important contribution of the book, but the crisis of 2008 tended to reduce the importance of this difference. And now that we are with a lot of struggle trying to exit from the long-term impact of the 2008 crisis and from the more recent impact of the pandemic crisis, these kind of differences are going to re-emerge and to enlarge. And this is why we are talking of a process of progressive diversification inside the Mediterranean model. This do not mean that Portugal and Spain are a completely different model of capitalism than Italy and Greece, but there are some process of differentiation. And what is particularly important is to look at the driver of this process of differentiation. That is, I mean, we realized this process during the making of the book, because also the previous kind of work on, for example, Molina wrote the book, the chapter that Anke mentioned, they did not emphasize so much this process of diversification. So what is important for us is to better understand the driver that favored this process of diversification. And along with this process of diversification, there are also things that are continuing to resemble a lot across the countries. Like, for example, the kind of innovation policies that they are doing, that is very, very much similar. So we see differentiation across some institutional arena, and we see also a process of major similarities in other kind of arenas. And the fact, in our view, the fact that there are a lot of similarities in innovation and industrial policies in the 4 countries, these help us to understand why they faced a lot of problem in reacting to the crisis. And especially because they adopted some policy instruments that were not able to promote exactly what Anke was mentioning, this interplay between public and private research, and the interaction between public and private actors. That is, as we very well known, that is very important in order to promote innovation. So, but by this point of view, these commonalities in terms of policies for innovation explain why they faced a lot of difficulties in exiting from the 2008 crisis, and probably they will face a lot of problem even now in exiting from the pandemic, even if there is a very big question mark, as Marino said before, because the plan for recovery for example, for the Italian case is promoting very massive investments in many of the institutional fields that we analyze with the book. So probably this is a very critical juncture, and it's particularly important to continue to study the changes in this kind of arena for the coming years, because probably there is this, as I said before, a critical juncture, and this process of diversification can reinforce and probably enlarge also to other areas such as innovation policies, and this could lead to have a model of capitalism characterized by huge internal differences, whilst now this is not the case. So it makes sense, I think, still to think in terms of Mediterranean economies if we compare the European model made by the continental one, the Nordic one, or the countries of Central and Eastern Europe that are facing the low road, etc. So there are still similarities, but also some process of change. And the second thing that I want to say, but I think my time is running out. But the second thing that I want to say is about one dimension that we only in part took into account in the book, especially in the conclusion. So why, and this is another question that Anke made in her comments, why we decided not to make very important reforms in many institutional fields. And partly Marino in his introduction tried to formulate some hypotheses on why this happens, but we do not emphasize the role of interest association, as you mentioned. Why? Because you said why business communities did not press toward having important reforms in these fields. And I think that if we take into account public administration, that is one of the very important weaknesses, especially in Italy and Greece, but also, even if they are a bit better, also in Spain and Portugal. If we want to understand why in these countries we were not able to promote a very strong process of reforms in that very key institutional arena, we have to take into account the difference that there is in all the four countries between within unions in exposed sectors, like, for example, textile or machinery industries, and unions in protected sectors that are much more conservative. So this is probably one of the reasons that we did not take into account in the book, but that plays a very important role in order to explain why in one specific policy arena, that is public administration, we were not able to introduce reforms. But at the same time, finally, I want to finish with this. You mentioned, Anke, the role of a growth model, and we have already discussed this when we presented your wonderful book with Bruno here at the CISEC. I strongly believe that we are in a country that, according to national statistics, fit very well with the demand, with the kind of public support demand. But at the same time, there is a large part of Italy that is running a lot, exporting, etc. We have already discussed this, so I will be very brief. And that is the northern part of the country. But the fact that Italy has these so huge internal differences create also some problem, and this is the point that I want to emphasize now, created many problems, I think, in order to generate an homogeneous demand in terms of reforms, because the kind of demands that different regions promoted toward the national governments were completely different, because the kind of exigencies were completely different. And this means that the kind of reaction that the national government made was a kind of reaction not toward the high-level policies such as innovation, for example, but toward a very kind of internal devaluation strategies. That is what has been followed, surely in Italy, but also partly in Portugal and in Spain. So the internal differences by the territorial point of view can help can help us probably to explain why the demand of reforms was so fragmented, and this high level of fragmentation pushed toward not applying the right kind of reform. So I will stop here in order to.
Thank you, Luigi. Thank you. We are running out of time, unfortunately. I ask Emmanuele to continue discussion and remind colleagues who want to make questions to start writing them down in the chat, please.
Thanks, Ivana. Thanks, Cathie and Anke, for your wonderful comments and discussion. I'll try to keep it as short as possible. And if I have time, I'll try to give some feedbacks and first answers also to Paolo Barbieri, who wrote an interesting question on the chat. As we just said, I will mostly focus on Cathie's questions, but there are a couple of points I'd like to make also on Anke's discussion. For Cathie, yes, we tried to start working on culture. I think when I read your paper, the first version, was it almost, oh my God, 2 years ago, because it was before the pandemic, I was like, wow, this would be great for Southern Europe. So, I mean, what we did with Gemma is a kind of a starting point. So all your questions, we'll need a lot of them, year-long research to be answered, also in comparative terms. But again, if I look at your perspective on the article you recently published on the British Journal of Political Science, the point is we see long-term commonalities among Southern European countries, and we can study them, and already there is part of the literature on that, comparative literature compared to Central Northern Europe. Still, the puzzle, as you say, is why in the last 25 years, the Iberians went one way and Greek and Italy did not really go another way, they just stopped. So the real point of the way, and again, as I said with Gemma, we've been discussing as with many other colleagues, is why modernization stopped practically in Italy and Greece compared to Spain and Portugal. So in this respect, it's less of a puzzle of what happened in Portugal and Spain, it's more of a puzzle of what happened and what's still happening in Greece and Italy. One point we started to raise in the paper and then we decided to stop, but that will need further research, for instance, about Southern Europe, is the role of religion. If you look at, I don't know, Philip Mano's comparative analysis on religion and the welfare state, it clearly shows that one of the characteristics of Southern European countries is religious monopoly by strong churches. So 3 states are Catholic and 1 is an Orthodox. And that's something we will have to look into an interplay between that and how modernization worked. But of course, like a long-term perspective will be very, very helpful in this respect. The welfare state and your questions about the welfare state. Well, since the beginning in this book, there were practically 2 different positions. I was the one among the 3 of the editors advocating to say, look, it doesn't exist a Southern European model. Italy and Greece are going just down the way, whereas there is perhaps hope for Spain and Portugal. But that was in a way considered too extreme, and I thank Marino and Luigi for that, for not letting my pessimism about Greece and Italy to take the lead. But for welfare state, you're right. That in a way is the weak point in the chapter that I wrote with other friends and colleagues myself. The point is increasingly difficult to frame within a Southern European welfare state regime or family 4 countries. What really happened, in our opinion, is that if the Great Recession would have not taken place in 2008 and afterwards, probably nowadays we would not talk about a Southern European welfare model. We would talk about at least 2 or 3, perhaps, with Greece going somewhere else. I don't know. So the paradox is that, as in a way, as Sophia says it in her chapter, and you underlined it in your comments, the 2007-8 crisis and the years afterwards represented a huge push to push together in the same direction countries which were going in different directions. So it's going to be interesting what's going to happen in this decade after the pandemic, as Marino was saying. The next generation of recovery plans are going to be great occasions, and a lot of money has been given by Europe to Italy and Spain. And comparative analysis on the political economy of recovery plans, I think comparing Italy and Spain is going to be a big part of what we might do as a researchers of comparative political economies in the future. Oh my gosh, it's already 6 minutes gone. So here again, I think that we will have to understand more, but increasingly there are tensions and differences. So it's increasingly hard to talk about a model. Now, I wanted to go back to other 2 points. One was raised by Anke, was about the business role. On the business role and the welfare state and political economy, again, Cathie wrote a wonderful book with a colleague some years ago, and the chapter she wrote also on Bruno's and Anke's book, again, is a great chapter to read, and I advise everybody to read it. So I'm very happy to discuss that with Anke and Cathie. Well, we are doing a research right now on the topic with another colleague of mine who was here, Sabrina Colombo and David Natali, and it's an international comparative research, and Cathie is involved in the scientific board. Well, if I should just provide a first take, the specificity of Italian business is that it's so fragmented that it is not really able to express a kind of a homogeneous position on how the economy should change. And in the last 20 years, that has been increasingly so. There is such a fragmentation and polarization within the business world that is increasingly difficult to put on the agenda a reform agenda. So what they are able to do is just ask for more liberalization and the basic things they can agree on, which is a kind of a raw textbook version of liberalization the Italian way. But they are not able to develop, because they are too fragmented and not united, a kind of more complex, or they're not even able to build big coalitions among themselves or with other groups. They are not able to put a liberalization agenda, a serious one. So as I said, what we're finding out, they're just being able to try to cut down on labor costs. That's the only thing that they can agree on, and then everybody follows a different strategy to grow. When I say everybody, I mean different economic branches and big versus small enterprises. Coming to Paolo's questions, yes, I would say that 80% of our answer is what has been missed in Southern Europe has got to do with endogenous problems. So we can't blame Europe, we can't blame international institutions. Sophia Perez argues partially differently on the way interbanking loans and banking regulation and financial and banking flows work during and before and after the 2008. That can be included, but is mostly endogenous. And when you look at why, as you say in your chart, okay, but why low high inefficiency and so on, we do not have a final answer. You can find answers here and there on different chapters. So, for instance, Capano and Lippi's chapters shows you exactly how Spain and Portugal, and it's got to do a lot with agency more than institutions in this case, tried and attempted partially to reform their public administration, which was practically a complete failure in Greece and almost a total failure in Italy. I think that in the future, we have to study a lot more what happened in the 90s. So from the late 80s until the mid 2000s, because those have been like the 15, 20 years where the big point of what happens after Fordism in Western capitalist economies came up. And Nordic countries came up with a recipe, which was kind of making sense. The same happened with countries like Germany. It followed the traditional industrial path, but it also changed, opening up to knowledge-intensive services. Italy is a tragedy in this respect. Italy was kind of not too far away from Germany in the late 80s, early 90s. And then critically, a lot of the reforms went the wrong way, or went in a way that it did not help to solve some of the basic problems. As Luigi would say, it's not that we didn't do reforms, but the reforms we've made were wrong or did not work as expected in any way, even from the intentions. And why is that? Well, again, there are a lot of reasons. We try to work on coalitions, and how different political and social coalitions have worked or not worked in Italy. Again, it's just a start, because I would say, and I think that Anke and Cathie can agree on that, also with Luigi and Marino, the idea of working more instead of single parties or single political and economic actors on coalitions among them is something coming out in the last 5 years in the literature. And that could be very fruitful to provide better answers also to your question. Thanks.
Thank you, Emmanuele. Thank you for being so direct. And I remind colleagues who want to contribute to the discussion to write down question in the chat. And I ask Marino if he wants a final word for discussion. And then I ask you to be patient and tolerant. We will go on recovering the time we lost at the very beginning till, let's say, 4:45. Okay, so please, Marino.
Oh, thank you. It's almost impossible to conclude such a rich discussion in a few minutes. I wish to thank very much Anke and Cathie, because their comments were extremely useful and intelligent, and we'll have to think a lot about them. I don't have time to answer all of them. To most of them, Emmanuele and Luigi have answered already. I would just pick, just to finish, to conclude, the first major question that Cathie raised. If I wrote it correctly, what precisely is the Mediterranean model? And what does it say about comparative political economy? That's the $1 million question that she asked. I do think that trying to respond just out of the blue, then of course I should think much more carefully about an articulated answer. I would say that. What it shows is the fact that typologies that we built, for instance, the varieties of capitalism, dichotomy, or several other typologies like Spin-Anderson, 3 words of capitalism. Most typologies that we built for analytical purposes, and knowing that they not necessarily had a lot of descriptive power, because of course then the description of every individual case was not perfectly fitting one type or the other. In this case, should be reversed, in the sense that what the Mediterranean model, or better, what the Mediterranean countries have in common are a lot of features that we can describe as common. We have seen that there are different features, but basically most features are still, in spite of what Emmanuele was saying now, still common. And yet it is difficult to say that they add up to an analytical model. Let's take the dichotomy liberal market economies versus coordinated market economies. It has been criticized, first of all, because a dichotomy is too simple, and of course, no country except Germany and the United States completely fit one or the other type. But what we have here for the Southern European countries is not so much a mixed market model as Oscar Molina, and but what we have here is something different. Is the fact that we don't have that institutional complementarity that the theoreticians, the authors of the varieties of capitalism assumed. They assumed that either a liberal market economy or a coordinated market economy work because they have the institutional complementarity. Now, what we have in these countries is that there is no institutional or better, that there is some institutional complementarity, but a lot of institutions don't fit, are not complementary to the others. And as Emmanuele was just saying, reforms in several cases, especially in Italy, have gone in the wrong direction from this point of view, in the sense that they have not intensified or enhanced the institutional complementarity, but they have made the institutions more and more different and not easy to coexist one to the other. So I think that if there is as Cathie was saying, what does it say about comparative political economy? Is that comparative political economy should restart from a much more careful description of individual cases again, in order to then go back to building typologies, because the existing typology, the typologies we do have now, our analytical toolkit, I think is not sufficient, is not even much useful anymore as it used to be, at least at the beginning. That's a general point. Of course, I would like to qualify a lot about that if I had time, but my major answer would be like this. Thanks a lot again to the discussants and to the audience, even though we didn't have the time to answer other questions.
Thank you, Marino. Thank you. I think that we can exploit time left and some additional time to open the floor. By now, I only received one question by Paolo Barbieri. I posed to the authors about the fact that your analysis points out endogenous factors of explanation of the difficulty of Southern European economies to be competitive and to grow. So Paolo is asking, but which are the actual reason of this backwardness? The low capacities of innovation is plain with backwardness of Southern European countries. But why are they so backward? This is his point. I take the chance to add a question. I had also the chance to have a preview of your book. And I was impressed, of course. But I also was impressed by the fact that something that Southern European countries shared in recent decades, that is migration, was not considered as an important point. Emanuele is laughing because we already discussed about this, but I want to precise my point. I'm perfectly aware that it is a socio-demographic change, it is a societal change, the effect of migration. But in the perspective of political economy, migration is also a substitute for innovation. So it is something on which Southern European countries have relied to avoid innovation, have exploited to, how could I say, to lower labor costs without changing some aspect of the regulation. So I wonder whether it's time for political economy, explaining Southern European countries' dynamics, to make space for this trend of change. Nobody answering?
If you want, I can say something and then Luigi can add up. Okay,
Emanuele, go ahead.
Well, no, migration, yeah, we discussed it a lot. Then we couldn't make it. But you're totally right. I think we would need in the future more comparative analysis on the impact of migration on Southern European political economies and how they change labor costs. And in many ways, if I understand correctly, the literature you also wrote, by the way, with others, brutally said, migration fits really well in this neither high or low road. And it strengthens it a lot, especially where it goes, but you're totally right. That's, you might call it a flaw in the book, or you might call it an opportunity for further research in the future on the topic, which is how to integrate more analysis on migration and comparative political economies in Southern Europe. Thanks for the suggestions.
And okay.
May I add something on the Paolo's point? Yeah. The reason, and also your point, Ivana, I think that one of the reasons for the backwardness of these countries is the fact that there has been an interplay between structure and agency. And in terms of agency, as Emmanuele said before, and also the book emphasized, we did the wrong reforms in the wrong, exactly that were not able to promote a readjustment that was necessary during the 90s. And we did the wrong reforms in many policy fields. And we did the wrong reforms. And why we did the wrong reforms? Because actors play in a very bad way their possible agency. And the reason why they played a wrong agency in terms of setting up of appropriate policies is written in the conclusion. So Paolo, you can buy the book, but also in the presentation
$32 only.
Sorry, Marino?
$32 only.
Yeah, only. But the final part of the presentation of Marino was, I think, an important contribution of the book that explained why there were institutional reasons that that make wrong policies. In some cases, let's say in this way, in some cases, wrong policies produce consensus. And this is one of the reasons why we played in a very bad way our agency. But if we want to explain this, we have to look to many different policies arena, and looking at many different policies arena and the wrong policies in all these policies arena is not saturating the model. It's simply trying to take together different arenas in order to explain how institutional complementarities can work in an opposite way and create hinders rather than possibilities. Marino, I don't know if you want to add something.
No. I was just, when you said that you can buy the book, I was just adding that it only costs $32. So it's certainly cheap, and we hope. No, it was a joke, but it is really extremely difficult to summarize. There are a lot of arguments, not only because the three of us developed our arguments in a more sophisticated way, of course, in the introduction, in the conclusion, but because the different voices of the contributors in the 8 chapters, though being rather consistent, because I want to remind that we had several meetings during the making of the book, and we confronted the draft versions. So we discussed the book in the making. So the chapters are rather consistent, but still they have different views as it is, and this, I think, gives a richness to the analysis that it's impossible to summarize here in just a few words. I do think that the debate today, thanks to Anke and Cathie, has been very fruitful and extremely analytical, but it is, at least on my side, it is impossible to say much more in the time that we don't have left.
We don't have it left, but I try to squeeze it as much as possible.
Okay.
Sorry, Marino.
No, very good. I was.
No. You are perfectly right. But I'm aware, waiting for question if they turn up. I'm aware that you are aware of the importance of the territorial divide and territorial differences. And being Italian, I can't be worried about these issues, also in the perspective of the opportunities that are opening, because this is a huge problem, putting some worries for the future use of resources. So I wondered if you could analytically set the territorial dimension within your analysis, or you can add something on this point.
Who wants I think that Luigi said something already. So.
Yes, me and Emmanuele, we are working in order to include this dimension in this kind of work. But what we wanted to emphasize is that now, more than in the past, it's important to take into account both the national and the regional dimension, and especially the relations between the two. Because in the past, you can, I mean, there were a lot of studies that adopted a sort of a very localistic approach without taking into account the kind of institutional structure at national level. What emerged clearly, in our view, is that national policies play a very important role in order to set the rule of the game for regional actors, and also in order to create some important collective goods that cannot be produced at the regional level. So it's a very important topic, it's a notable topic, and I mentioned also this topic when we discussed the book of Anke and Bruno. But I think that it's not important to look at the regional level, but it's important to look to interplay to the national policies and the kind of reaction to national policies that local actors produce, even because national policies have territorial effects. I don't know if Emmanuele or Marino want to add something on this.
No, I agree with what you said. I don't have anything. There are some other questions, but I don't know who's asking them. It's about Greece. Oh, okay, Gabriel. That's a very important point, the point that Gabriele Ballerino is making about how if I understand it correctly, how the geography and also how the political economy of geographical changes changed, sorry for mixing the words, after 1990. Yeah, that's something that we need to study more. When I say we, I hope it's not just the three of us or other writing and participating in this research. It's a more general question. So Gabriele, I totally agree with you. My impression increasingly is that we will have also to mix with economic history. We need to reconstruct better single paths and how they are shaped by changes as the one you show about the new members getting in. It's very hard, and I understand Paolo's point as well. He wrote again on that. It's kind of hard to strike a balance on one type of methodology we should use. It's really complicated. We got a small n problem no matter what we do. So again, in this respect also, I invite you to read Cathie's article she was quoting before, because she does a very interesting analysis on other types of data, long-standing data, but Central Eastern Europe has changed a lot. The game in Western Europe, of course, it seems trivial, but please, one thing, at least for me, was not clear before we started this book. I had a kind of a naive idea of Central Eastern Europe before the book, which was a kind of a naive idea. It was like, okay, Central Eastern Europe is becoming the low-cost tax haven for corporations in Western Europe. Well, that's not the case. As Anke was showing, part of the convergence is not just simply foreign direct investments. Central Eastern Europe is modernizing a lot, also its economic structure. Now, why I've been able to do that in Italy, Spain, Greece, Portugal less, again, it's a big question, and I think the suggestions Gabriele makes have to be very seriously to be taken into consideration for future research.
Okay, I try to encourage some last question, because I would say that in a couple of minutes we can close our plenary. no other question, but we used all the time we had. So I only remind, I'm happy to have spent this time with you and discuss with you about the book. And I go to close our plenary. But Maurizio Aula reminds me to remind everybody other organizational issues. So sorry for such a closure. I have to recall you that at 6:45 we have the online aperitivo. So it's important meeting. The pivotal meeting, and if you want to join, please use your personal computer rather than a smartphone. You
Ivana, aren't we supposed to have still sessions at 6? Or am I wrong?
Yes.
So we're
This is
the
last
session.
I'm going backwards. No. This is the last message I received. But don't forget, before this, our 5th parallel session, starting at 5. I think we have 20 minutes time to discuss or do whatever we want. Okay. So I thank you again, all keynotes, our discussants, and again, it was really a pleasure to share this time with you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cathie.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anke and Cathie.
Have a lovely aperitivo.
Wonderful job.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody, for the questions.